I want to introduce our moderator for the panel, Jenny Ho, who's AFSCME's Assistant Director for Research and Collective Bargaining Services. Jenny has over 15 years' experience in the labor movement, previously serving as the Director of Advocacy for the Washington Federation of State Employees, a labor economist for AFSCME International, a strategic researcher for UFCW, and a community organizer for the SEIU. We've really done a tour. That's awesome. Please welcome our panel to the stage. Jenny, you take it away. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Amanda. Hi, good afternoon. Okay, so we're here to talk about AI and democracy. I want to welcome our panelists, and they all have very impressive bios, but I'm going to try to briefly go over some highlights. So to my right, we have Cathy Feingold. Cathy is a special advisor for global affairs at the AFL-CIO. Cathy has 20 years of experience in trade and global economic policy and in worker, human, and women's rights issues. Cathy is the deputy president of the International Trade Union Confederation, representing 200 million unionized workers worldwide. Her worker advocacy has truly had global impact, from directing the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center's work in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, where she worked to improve working conditions by partnering with local trade unions, to leading international coalition efforts to shape global labor standards. And this includes the recently ratified International Labor Organization Convention 190. This is the first international treaty, yes, please, the first international treaty to recognize the right of everyone to a workplace free from violence and harassment. All right. And then next we have Megan Shahi. She is the Director of Technology Policy at the Center for American Progress. Megan has experience across the public and private sectors. She's worked to improve transparency and accountability inside social media giants such as Meta and Twitter. Megan was the crisis manager in Meta's first ever US election war room. This was in 2018. Which worked to combat misinformation. Megan has also served on the White House Domestic Policy Council and the Department of Treasury's Office of International Affairs and Office of Domestic Finance. We also have Janet Haven, Executive Director of Data and Society, an independent research institute that studies the social implications of data, automation, and AI. Janet has over 20 years of experience working in the intersection of tech policy, governance, and accountability. Janet serves on the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, which advises President Biden on AI issues. And we have Matt Scherer, Senior Policy Counsel for Workers' Rights and Technology Policy at the Center for Democracy and Technology. CDT promotes democratic values by shaping technology policy. Matt works with other civil society organizations to advocate for governments and private organizations to adopt policies that protect workers' digital rights and to ensure that new technologies enhance social justice and equality. All right. So I'm going to start by continuing the discussion on AI and election integrity. Clearly something that many of us are anxious about. And I'm going to start with Megan. How will AI impact the upcoming elections? And how do you think big tech will be addressing the public concerns that risk the AI poses to election integrity?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having us to the AFL and SAG-AFTRA. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm here from Washington, D.C., and like Jenny mentioned, my background is from the tech platforms themselves. I have spent a number of years on the platform and product policy teams, feeling like I was rowing up a creek without a paddle for many of those years, and have since transitioned to the civil society side. And when I think about the role of any technology in elections or just in any social issue, I kind of have a guiding principle here, which is that technology makes good things better and bad things worse. And I find that that really holds true as I think about AI and the risks that it poses to this election cycle and all future election cycles. Over 2 billion people will head to the polls around the world this year. And with that is a backdrop of the companies backsliding, as Maya very eloquently mentioned, mass layoffs to where the people that were protecting these elections inside the companies are not there anymore to a vast degree, and the advent of new technology like generative AI. And so I think of AI really as a tool that reduces the barriers for people, whether well-intentioned or with bad intention, to enter and engage the information ecosystem. And the information ecosystem is the platforms that we all use today, where we're consuming the vast majority of our information and forming our opinions on social issues that we then take to the polls. So AI can help somebody write a letter to their congressperson on an issue they care about, and it can also help them create a deep fake of a presidential candidate. And so to appropriately balance those risks and those opportunities, of which there are many of both, it's incumbent on the platforms where that content really gets disseminated to do their jobs, to educate users, to take down misinformation, to launch public literacy campaigns, which was spoken about in the last panel as well, and really take responsibility for being the place that people are consuming vast troves of information. And we have seen, if history has shown us anything, it is the failure of these companies to self-regulate. I have been inside of them trying to write policy and shape the direction of products to safeguard users and to uphold privacy and all of those lovely things. And it has obviously not yielded too much. And so regulation coupled with platform responsibility, coupled with public literacy, are some of the keys to getting at this, but it still comes down really to the places that we are consuming information and less the tools that people are using to enter and engage in the information ecosystem.
Cathy, Megan just mentioned that 2 billion people worldwide will be going to the polls. So what role will AI play in these elections outside of the US, and how are unions outside the US engaging in these elections?
Thanks so much, and it's great to be here, and it's exciting to bring a global perspective to this conversation. So let me unpack a little bit. What exactly does it mean to say we think over 2 billion people will be going to the polls, whether at the national level or at the local level? We're talking not just the United States, the European Union, which has been key in some of the regulatory policy, will be having some of its parliamentarian elections. Mexico, the UK will probably call elections. Some of our major partners, India, Indonesia, South Africa, all around the world, working people will be going to the polls. So what does this mean? We've already heard about some of the problems with misinformation on the various panels. It also makes a huge difference who will be elected, who will be shaping the policies. It makes a big difference in our country, who is leading, who has an AI task force, and what are the priorities of that administration. There is so much at stake. We just saw in Argentina an election that happened where they used misinformation by calling the opposition commies and emperors and a ton of misinformation. And what was the first thing that the new government of Argentina did after using all of that misinformation and winning the vote is attacked labor law reform. Hard-fought protections that the Argentine unions had won. So I think there's a lot at stake. I also want to mention that we think a lot about Facebook and some of the major companies here in the US, but remember, in most of the countries around the world, candidates aren't well funded. They don't raise $1 billion to win the presidency. And so they rely on trying to get their information out quickly. They're going to be using AI to get their information out broadly. Not all of it could be misinformation. And they will be using platforms that have never committed to protecting people against misinformation. And so what are unions doing? Well, at one extreme is on January 24th, the Argentine unions are taking to the street in a national strike. And they are pushing back against what's happened to them, which is, their democracy is at stake. You see other unions we've just launched at the global level. The International Trade Union Confederation has just launched a campaign for democracy so that we can come together and share across our countries, because so many of us will be going into elections, how are we communicating with our members directly so that they are clear that they are getting trustworthy information. But I will say quite honestly, we're behind. We're in 2024, we've got billions of workers going to the polls, and we still don't have the necessary resources or information to really counter what will be, for the first time ever, the largest elections ever to happen at the same time around the world, where artificial intelligence will be shaping what happens at the polls.
And I'm
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Just on the point of election disinformation, there was a great report that a couple of my colleagues at CDT came out with about a year ago that showed that, unsurprisingly, in the run-up to elections, women of color are far more likely to be subject to online abuse. Female candidates women of color are much more likely to be subject to disinformation campaigns. And when you're talking about how AI and technology can magnify existing inequalities, that is unfortunately a very good example of how that works. And online platforms are now cutting back on their human moderation teams and say that they're going to rely more on artificial intelligence to do that job. Well, it tells you where their priorities are about how much you think that they're going to be putting into those algorithms versus the ones that feed people the information that they will want to read. Tells you that they're cutting back on their human moderation teams in order to do that. So they're clearly not going to put the same amount of resources into the AI that removes that disinformation, that tends to target women of color more often, than they are in promoting and working on the algorithms that make sure that that steady diet of disinformation gets to the people who are going to click on it. So the need to kind of be cognizant of those issues and how it exacerbates existing inequalities is stronger than ever in a year where, like you said, 2 billion people are going to be going to the polls.
And Janet, what is the impact of AI to democracy at large and civil society?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to turn a little bit away from the question of elections and more broadly to the question of AI and democracy. Because we do see a lot of harms and threats to democracy from AI and from automated systems that go beyond the election cycle, and that even go beyond the question of trust in institutions, of trust in information, and trust in information environments, which I think, as our friends up here have talked about, is very significant. I think it'd be remiss to not talk about the impacts of a broad surveillance environment and of unfettered data collection that is necessary to fuel an AI environment. And I think that's particularly of concern and particularly salient for workers, because what we've seen is a huge broadening of data collection on workers in workplaces. And so the harms that we see associated with that are things like an expansion of algorithmic management, an erosion of individual privacy, lack of transparency in workplace decisions that are taken through automation, sometimes arbitrary and aggressive disciplinary action that is mediated through data collection. And we also see, and I think this is truly undermining a porousness of data collection beyond workplace collection. That is, we see data that is collected by employers sometimes in ways that are expected to help workers pass into the private sector. So for instance, some employers encourage the use of pay in advance apps that then sell that info onto financial and credit services institutions without employee consent. And I think critically what we see is that kind of data collection is deepening existing power imbalances and eroding collective power. So I see that broadening collection of data across all of society, but particularly in workplaces, as a real concern for democratic practice. We also have heard from our last panel about the threats to civil rights. And particularly, I want to highlight the threat of algorithmic discrimination, which is well documented that we've seen that happen. We've seen that AI systems and algorithmic systems are biased, that they discriminate against marginalized populations. This is very clearly because the data that those systems are trained on is biased, because it reflects society. It reflects what we see across society, and it is almost never changed or cleaned. It is hoovered up from across the internet and other data sources and used to train AI models. And so it is unsurprising that those systems discriminate. And then I think the last thing that I would mention that I think is important in terms of AI and democracy is that we see a threat to human agency, that we don't always see humans in the loop in decision-making. In workplace environments, we don't always see humans in decision-making roles, in critical infrastructure, in military use of AI, and the choice to design systems that remove humans from critical decision-making pathways in all areas of society is, I think, a real threat to democratic practice. And then I guess just one more thing that I would add is, I run a research institute that studies the impacts of data-centric technologies on society. And I think what's really important to put out there is that we don't know all of the impacts on society. We don't know the political or cultural or systemic impacts of these systems on society, and we need to think about those impacts in context and to be continuing to research that, to learn about that, so that we can design regulatory systems that are responsive.
I'm going to move us to start chatting about solutions. And I'll start with Megan. What regulations do we need to protect our democratic processes, especially with AI that is evolving so rapidly?
How much time do we have? That's a big question.
I think just like 10 minutes.
Okay, good to know.
Total.
I'll make it quick. There have been a lot of steps already kind of put in place that I think are pointing the needle of the compass in the right direction on this in the U.S. We were chatting as a panel group before this about the AI Bill of Rights that came out of the Biden administration last year, and then the subsequent executive order this year, and a series of insight forums on the Hill and other sort of interest demonstrated by leaders to get this right. And I think we are all, I hope, scarred from the lessons of social media and eager not to make those mistakes again. I will let my other panelists kind of chime in on this, but one thing I kind of want to leave you all with on the regulatory piece is that there is this chasm between what the AI developers do for things that they kind of manage that are first-party usage. So you can think of OpenAI's ChatGPT, kind of that's the best example. You can report on ChatGPT, they have a usage policy, they'll do some filtering to make sure you're not putting inputs that are leading to really violative or abusive outputs. But there's this API access component where pretty much anybody can pay to utilize that model in any facet that they want. and there is no oversight by the developers themselves, so that's Google, Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, and the others, that really regulates or safeguards that third-party usage. And there's no responsibility scheme or model that is set up, and everyone is passing the buck right now. And so as I think about what regulation needs to look like, it's a lot of the stuff that's already been talked about in DC and elsewhere, but also this third-party component is very significant and will come rushing to the surface the moment a really, really bad application of generative AI goes viral.
And I'm curious, was that addressed at all in the most recent executive order?
No.
Oh.
Yes.
That's
so
alarming.
we're eager to see more on that.
And Cathy, if you could provide a global perspective on what other unions outside the US are doing.
On the regulatory front, I would say unions have been at the table for a long time. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development released its AI principles a while ago, and we've been trying to encourage governments to sign on. Unions in the European Union and the UK both have new tools with the passage in 2023 of the EU's Digital Safety Act, the UK's Online Safety Act, that are really about obligations of platforms to combat hate speech and information. But at the end of the day, we can have all of this regulatory policy, but as we've heard from other panelists, it's about organizing, and it's about holding our politicians accountable. So I wanted to just highlight a few things that are happening in real time. In Brazil, the labor movement finally pushed out their right-wing government, and Lula is back. And yes, and I just want to underscore the role that global labor movement solidarity played in getting him out of jail and supporting him, and he is back, and he's having a huge impact. And one of the things is organizing, the platform workers are organizing, and Uber is scared because you have an alignment of worker power and a government that is ready to regulate. So that's one very concrete example. In Spain, in August 2021, you have the Riders Law, which is really called the Stop Fake Autonomous Act, which really gives power to workers in the digital platform, right? Workers' legal representation has to be informed of the rules that algorithms and artificial intelligence systems are playing in their lives. So as we're talking about all this regulation, and I would say the EU is ahead of us, and they've just passed some new regulation on AI, and the unions have been at the table shaping that. What we are really focused on right now is how do we educate, how do we build power? Because at the end of the day, workers are on the front line of democracy, whether it's elections or whether it's in their workplaces. So we have lots of good examples of platform workers organizing. I wanted to mention one, we talked about how unions can proactively use artificial intelligence. And in Australia, we have an example there where unions are turning the table on AI, and they're using it to identify wage theft in hospitality. So there's a model we might want to share here with colleagues. And so I think when I think of hope, you know, we're talking about a lot of fear around AI, what we're seeing around the world are models of workers coming together to organize, to put in their collective bargaining agreements, really hard-fought language. And I just want to end by saying, anywhere I go, I just want to give a shout out to my siblings at SAG-AFTRA. Everyone says, but really, it's that SAG-AFTRA language. And the world was watching what the Writers Guild, what SAG-AFTRA, what the UAW is doing. I cannot tell you enough the impact you have had around the world, giving workers hope that you really can take on enormous industries and win. And everybody is asking us for your language and going online, and they are really looking at how they can take that language so that we're not reinventing the wheel country by country, but we are building frameworks of collective bargaining agreements and best practices and sharing it around the world.
Matt, what are the regulations we should be prioritizing?
So, speaking of Australia, the labor unions there have been very active in the workplace technology space. The Victorian Trade Halls Council had me give a presentation to occupational safety and health representatives on the impact of electronic surveillance a few months ago, so that they could create a page giving advice to all the union reps in the various, locations that they have across Victoria, to keep an eye out for this technology that was not even yet in widespread use there, but so that they knew what their options were under Australian law and what they needed to advocate for to make sure that they could protect their workers that they represent from the harms that are represented by these systems. That's easier in Australia than it is in the United States because it's the wild, wild west here when it comes to automated surveillance systems and algorithmic management systems in the workplace. And like Maya said on the last panel, and like people have said repeatedly throughout the day and here, we need the union's organizing ability and heft to be brought to bear in this space. I'm going to share an anecdote. I'll make it as quick as possible because it shows what can go wrong when that doesn't happen. And that's the New York City bill that went into effect this year governing bias audits, providing bias audits for the use of AI in employment decisions. Well, here's the thing. It didn't really require bias audits. And what it does isn't really something that can be called regulation. What it does is it sets a very low bar that is very easy for companies to meet so that tech companies can go around and market their tools as bias-free. That's what's happening as a result of that law. And the reason that happened, that bill was written by lobbyists for a vendor. I'm not making that up. You can go to the lobbyist website and see them brag about how they wrote it for that vendor and how they identified the New York City Council as the place to introduce it and how they rammed it through. And civil society and labor activists were not well organized and were not able to mount an effective campaign to stop that bill from not just going through, but it actually got worse from the time that it was introduced to the time that it was passed. The few good things that were in it were ripped out, and the bill got rammed through the city council without any opportunity to debate those changes that weakened the bill and gutted it. And now here's the problem. Because New York City did it, and New York City is a well-known progressive bastion in theory, that's the standard that other states are looking at as sometimes the ceiling of what should be achievable on those sorts of regulations. And there is a real danger that model of legislation that is really just providing a fig leaf is going to be what regulates technology in the workplace and in a lot of other spheres unless we organize and be proactive about it and make sure that the natural allies that are in the labor rights movement and the civil rights movement and civil society organizations are being proactive and are getting together and making sure that everybody is aware when bad legislation comes up and crafting what good policy looks like in this space.
Janet?
So I'm going to go out on a limb here and be slightly more optimistic, which is to put this moment that we're in terms of regulation in the broader historical context. You're absolutely right. It has been in the United States the Wild West. I think technology companies operated with essentially total impunity. And Congress occasionally sort of got themselves together and had a hearing and then did nothing. And so we have ended up with social media being essentially the dumpster fire that it is now. Because I think of a confluence of reasons, the dumpster fire of social media being one of them, the sudden appearance of ChatGPT and its kind of very, very public media space, taking up so much space in the media and public interest about it. It has really put, I think, regulators in a position where they recognize that they must act. And again, historically, that has not happened, but I think there is a lot of momentum right now, a lot of pressure on Congress to take action, to put in place actual legislation. And some of that pressure comes from the current administration, which has done a lot of work from the executive branch over the past 2.5 years to put out regulation in every way they possibly could, which is basically through the launch of an executive order on AI, which came out at the end of October, beginning of November this past year. And what that executive order did was to put in place some accountability mechanisms for AI, and then to direct the federal agencies broadly. What they were directed to do individually is to figure out what their existing powers are in relation to AI. That is, how can we use existing civil rights law and protections in an AI environment, which is a tool that was always there, but was not really used. And so I think those kinds of steps are really, really important. We also saw accompanying the executive order a draft memo from the Office of Management and Budget, which created a set of directions for how agencies should govern AI. And I think there are a couple of critical things in that memo, if it's still in draft form, and so we don't have the final version of it until probably March. But one of the critical things that the memo directs agencies to do across the executive branch is to evaluate AI systems for their impacts, to look for rights violations and safety violations. And if the AI does not meet a minimum bar of not violating civil rights, it cannot be used, which, again, remarkably, is not the case right now. And so those kinds of prohibitions, I think, are really strong. What we really, really need is for Congress to take that up, to take it forward, and to put in place legislation that advances hard accountability. I could not agree more with everyone who has said this on this panel and in the previous panel, that relying on self-regulation is an absolute non-starter. We cannot do that. We already know that. And so the kinds of organizing that can push Congress to put in place a broad set of accountability measures to govern AI is so important right now. But I also think, as I started, that there is an openness to this that has never been there before.
Just very briefly, I also have hope that there is space to make good policy on this at the state level. There is pending legislation in a number of states that would really protect workers' rights when it comes to the use of technology in the workplace. In New York and California and Massachusetts, there's pending legislation that was crafted with workers' rights advocates that would really effectively put useful limits on these technologies. So regardless of whether or not we are able to get Congress to move, there is still a need for everybody to keep their ear to the ground and their eye on the ball across the country, because if we don't work together to make good policy in this space, then you can be sure that the companies that are making these tools and using them will be pushing to make bad policy and to see it through.
So we do have a little bit of extra time to take some questions from the floor. Yeah? Any questions? Anyone want to come up and ask a question? Please.
I'm curious, Illinois.
So you can give your name and.
I'm so sorry. Richard Shavzin with SAG-AFTRA and the Chicago local. Illinois is the only state that's passed an actual constitutional workers' rights amendment to our state constitution. Do you guys know of any similar actions going on anywhere else?
I've not heard about that personally. I know that obviously the trend has been in the opposite direction for years and years. You know, right to work legislation has been introduced much more frequently at the state level, unfortunately, than legislation that would strengthen workers' rights to organize. But that is something that I will definitely keep an eye on going forward, and that is something that we engage with lots of civil society and labor advocates across the country to tie the workplace technology regulation to broader labor rights under state law.
Any other? Yes.
The government could use tools to force companies to invest in labor augmenting technologies rather than labor automating technologies. And a reason for that is that there's not like a magic bullet for increasing productivity in the service sector to a large degree. Workers actually do the best job of delivering services, and AI is mostly a tool to squeeze workers and to increase the bottom line. So do you see any policy proposals that are creating incentives or public investments to ensure that AI technologies are developed to augment labor rather than to automate labor?
Well, hi, Nell. But that's a good question. And no, I haven't seen legislation like that. The closest thing that I've seen, I have seen legislation that would make companies essentially meet certain requirements before they would automate away certain jobs. But I haven't seen the kind of the converse of it, what you were talking about, looking for ways to basically incentivize companies to use AI and automation to enhance workers' rights. So I will be pinging you afterwards to see if you have further thoughts on how to make that happen.
Maybe just a couple of things to add on to that. I think that there are opportunities to create incentives towards that through two ways. One is limiting worker datafication, limiting data collection on workers. And I think there are real opportunities around that in right now. For instance, part of the executive order on AI was a directive to the Department of Labor to create guidance about data collection that would minimize harm to workers. So that's one area I think is worth looking at. And the other area is increasing worker participation in the design of AI systems that they're being asked to work alongside. And we talked about that. One of the earlier panels mentioned workers who were in a position to kind of respond to or give feedback to systems as they were being deployed. And I think there are opportunities to back that up into a much earlier stage of design. So that there is much more worker voice and worker power in the technologies that are actually being put in place.
And I would also welcome this idea. The global labor movement, the AFL-CIO, will be participating in this. For the first time ever, we're going to be creating a global standard on platform work, where I think all of these ideas can come together. The International Labor Organization will be bringing together employers, unions, and governments for a standard. As you mentioned, we've done it on gender-based violence, we've done it on domestic work, and we've won. Why this is relevant is because most countries in the world don't have a template for regulation, right? I mean, we've kind of been talking about EU or UK. The world does not have a template for this, and a lot of the world does not have expertise in what would be a pro-worker approach. And so I just wanted to mention one opportunity. As we're talking about all of these ideas, we should be collecting what would be best practices for a global standard that will often be cut and pasted by governments. So that's one. Major employers will be sitting at the table trying to prevent this from being pro-workers. So we're going to have a big job to be pushing back on that. But this is going to be also an organizing tool, as we saw with the domestic worker standard that was created at the International Labor Organization. That helped create the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights throughout the United States. As we saw with gender-based violence, I know my sisters here from Unite Here helped shape that. They were with us over in Geneva. So that's an opportunity for us to collect some of these best practices, these ideas, because we will be going to create this global standard that could have an enormous impact around the world.
We are out of time. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for providing your expertise and insight. I really learned a lot, and I know the audience did too.